All right, hello, welcome back. Today is our first official episode of the Futurism at CHU podcast. My name's Nicholas, and I'm joined by Ricardo, Max, and John, who you guys already know. And today's topic is artificial intelligence and neural networks. So to get the conversation started, I wanted to pose the question of, do you guys think that we can create a truly sentient AI?
Oh my gosh, this is such an exciting topic. I love talking about this. Okay, so one thing that I've read in various places is essentially, I can't remember the exact number, but there are certain levels of AI, right? And they are as basic as, say, for example, simple machine learning, which would consist of inputting data into a machine and then it outputting a result. So that would be like, you know how Amazon will predict what you want to buy based on your, purchase history, and things like that, or what, those are predictive algorithms that are considered artificial intelligence, right? Because it's sort of machine learning. But there are different levels of AI, and of course, the implication of neural networks is that at some point we'll be able to create a computer that can replicate the human brain, right? And be sentient in a way, right? So I guess it's sort of a weird question, but do we feel like once we create a computer that can simulate the human brain's function, does it become just as conscious as one of us? It's kind of a crazy thought that, I think about AI.
I think that that's a super interesting question to pose. And it's also a very messy question at the same time. Yeah. Not only because of all the repercussions that it could potentially have on society, who are we to say that a machine is not human if it thinks like a human?
Right. It's a, quote, human rights thing.
Exactly, then, right? It's a humanoid, right? Yeah. It's an android at that point. So, it poses a lot of different questions, but one of the things that I'm thinking about is just the way to get there first. And that in and of itself is just a whole journey. And especially what you were saying with how we have different types of AI, for stuff we've probably all heard this, the YouTube algorithm, things of that sort, where there's a very different way of thinking about AI, one of which is simply an algorithm. Let's say you have a computation that you want to do, and it's not necessarily as AI as it learning by itself. And also something that a lot of people don't know is that for a lot of these big AI projects, they literally have to force feed information. So people are generally the ones teaching instead of the machine teaching itself. So I feel in order to get to that point, which of course it would be super cool, but also kind of messy, like I said, we would need not only a lot of time, but a lot of improvement in the way that machines teach themselves, rather than simply taking in information and outputting something and then learning from that. So teaching itself and actually being sentient in a way, which would be the Kickstarter to a more, autonomous type of AI.
That's also a little spooky, though, too, because if you're asking a machine to sort of teach itself without force, quote, as you put it, force feeding it certain information, for example, and this is sort of going along the lines of dystopian Hollywood depictions of AI, but without morals or certain ethical codes, it could get a little bit messy. You know what I mean? Like you said, it's sort of this really messy route, or even just very, very different from, it would have very different values, right, from, even if they're not necessarily inherently bad, it could potentially gain different values, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that I like to touch a little bit upon, and this is just because I'm taking an ethics course right now, is we're talking about the fact of, okay, how do we teach, or what values do we give a computer to do certain things? Because, even within humans, right, a conversation between two humans, the variation in ethics can range due to background, due to experiences. So many things can impact a decision, where how do you let a computer decide what type of ethics or what type of algorithm to use to make choices? Do you use utilitarian method, where, the most happiness is always the answer? Or virtue ethics, where it depends on the person, or in this case, I guess the machine and what it was made to do.
Oh, whoa, that's trippy.
So a lot of these ethics questions kind of come into hand, especially when a computer is trying to decide something. Or do we simply just take the mean of, the average of all decisions and just make the AI or the computer do an average or take an average response that most people would make, which might not necessarily be correct, but it could potentially do. Also, I just thought about the Ultron movie, like the Avengers one.
Yeah.
You were saying, like an AI could potentially have a purpose, do that purpose, but its morals and its way to do it may not necessarily align with what a human would necessarily do, because it's only tasked to do a certain thing, and that's where like a lot of regulations and a lot of barriers will need to come in to sort of shape the way that a computer is able to do something without overreaching in its potential to harm a population or just humans in general.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, thinking about how a computer sort of sees itself in a society. Because as a human being, you sort of think very individually. You know what I mean? But once you give something consciousness that has, I guess, quote, power that sort of spreads over, that sort of, I guess, has sort of some sense of control over so many people. Like you said, you have to like really think about what kind of values you want that computer to have. Oh geez, that's complicated.
Really complicated and really messy, yeah.
I think those are really valid points. It's like, how do we create the best possible AI, like to avoid the apocalypse? Because like in theory, AI can be like infinitely smarter than humans, right?
Right, like theoretically, you could give it you could ask it to like if you gave it enough of the variables, you could ask it to solve climate change for you.
That's
and,
what I'm saying.
Crazy things like
Actually, that brings up a good point. Like, could we leverage AI to solve some of humanity's greatest problems? Like, I mean, like I always think of like IBM Watson, like just sifting through like gigantic amounts of data, like data that we couldn't normally filter that quickly before, and like that's one of the huge. Putting aside the apocalyptic dystopian world where AI takes over and destroys everything, like, it just has so much potential. But it's like, we have to be careful. Like, how do we both get as much as we can out of it to benefit humanity? But, like, how do we instill values in it that we want them? Like, maybe we want to, like, expose it to as much, like, positive values as possible. Like, make it, like, the ideal human. Right. You know what I mean, in a way?
I was just gonna say, if you create an AI that is, if you were to create an AI that is based off of the human brain, you could then modify, like air quote, modify the human brain, right? In that sense, right? So then it's sort of like, so at its core, like a human is a pretty emotional creature. You know what I mean? And if you were to create an AI that would, like if you were to sort of create a simulation of the human mind using a computer, that would also be emotional as well, because those same parts of the mind would be firing. It would have wants and desires, right? So then you could sort of take that and modify it to be much more powerful and faster than an average human brain. So then it would have all the things that we're looking for. Like you could create the ideal human mind in that sense. But then it becomes unethical to trap it and ask it to just do our work, right? Because because once you create a computer based off of the human mind, it has wants and desires because humans have wants and desires.
So is it in a sense like a new class of humans in a way? Like could we consider it human, or is it still its own? Or is it like similar enough to humans that we have to kind of give it freedom, I guess?
I feel like that depends on what you define a human as being. Does a human have to be flesh, or does it just have to be a consciousness?
Right, like if we upload your consciousness onto a computer, are you still human? Like, then that becomes the overarching question. Because off of that, you sort of start to branch out into if you're a human simply by having your consciousness be on something, regardless of the actual body, right? So let's say you have an android body and you're able to transport your consciousness onto it, you're still considered human. Then really what's the issue with considering like a copy of that human brain onto another body.
Okay, so just to like make things super clear, just so that I get what you're saying, it's sort of like if we were to like say scan Nicholas's brain right now and put it onto a flash drive and then plug it into a robot,
yes,
like a moving robot, like would that still be considered human? It'd be a clone of Nicholas at that point.
Right. Right. And then you have a clone, but then what if for some weird reason you're able to do that same thing, but now this body's left without? Like, does the original always mean human?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, right, I see. That's interesting.
Yeah, because I genuinely don't know how to think about it.
I mean, I think that raises the question of like the nature of consciousness and like, is there some like beyond like the physical? I mean, obviously that gets into like religion and stuff.
Right.
But like, is there something where it's like there's something beyond the physical that even if you could scan the brain and upload it, like it wouldn't necessarily be conscious, or like would it? Like, I guess also like if you're scanning the brain, it's not necessarily still you, right? Because you need the original, like to be like if you took a scan of my brain and put it into a computer, I think like what Max said, it would really be a clone of me. Right. Even if it was conscious, I don't think it would be me. I think it would be a different person. Like it'd be an exact clone of me, but not. I think my original consciousness would be here, unless as I'm still alive here, I could somehow have like half my brain like in the cloud and the other half like, you know what I mean, like combining it somehow, but not like completely transferring it. Okay. But that's just kind of where I stand. I want to hear what you guys think about that and like the nature of consciousness.
I think one analogy which I just thought of. Have you heard about that one where it's like if you have a ship and you change everything but a single part, is it still the same ship?
Ooh.
But a single part?
Yes. So it could be like the
like
mass
one,
of the ship. Yeah, like literally
like one plank.
Yeah, one plank. Is it still the same ship?
Oh, wow.
Like, or where do you draw the line where to this certain point after you change so many things, it's not. It's a whole new vehicle.
Okay, so as far as the ship goes, I would say once it is changed so much to the point where it's functionally different. Okay. If that makes sense, right? So, for example, if it were not as fast, or you know what I mean?
So,
or like if some. Okay. Because one plank isn't necessarily going to make that difference, but maybe the right plank would. You know what I mean? So, like, to the point where the difference in its performance isn't negligible, then it becomes a different ship to me. But I think that the things that make us human aren't necessarily the big things, it's the little details.
Right, okay.
So I think that a person would be functionally different.
Yes.
Like, for example, Nicholas's clone robot person that we're talking about hypothetically, that to me would be that would be a different person to me. And also, another thing to consider is the fact that suddenly there would be so much, like if you were to, say, plug this supposed flash drive with Nicholas's brain on it into a robot, and activate that robot and have it start having some sort of sensory perception and like I guess flip on the on switch on, it would start absorbing information that is different from what he's perceiving, right? Yeah. So I think that it would be different.
Okay.
I mean, my thing is, I don't think the ship analogy works because to me, so my view is you could change any part of the body, right? You can like get a new arm, you can get a new leg, you can get a new heart. I still think that's you.
Okay.
But I think my issue is the brain.
The brain.
I think the brain, you can have everything else replaced, but I think the brain, once you change that, I think that's a different person. So like, my thing is, really what makes us human is, or what distinguishes us from, other animals and, everything else in the universe is that we have consciousness, we have memories.
Right. And thumbs.
Yeah, those are really important.
But like, I don't know. It's just, to me, like, when you ask, like, who am I, right? Like, you could say, I'm the sum of my parts. You could also say, like, I am my consciousness.
Right.
but it's, I don't know, I don't think we've like truly answered the question of consciousness, like where it truly comes from.
Yeah.
Like, I think most people would agree it probably comes from like electrical signals in the brain somehow.
Yeah.
But like, how does that create something so abstract, you know? Like, it's just...
Well, I was just going to sort of bring this up about free will, right?
Ooh.
Like the whole question of free will.
Ooh.
Okay, so just to like sort of glaze over it real quick without getting too into it, essentially our brain is chemical reactions and, you know, electricity firing, you know, right, Nicholas?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, okay. So if all of these things were sort of set in motion at the Big Bang, right? And my brain is basically just chemistry.
Oh, I know you're getting at.
Does that mean that my decisions aren't actually my decisions? I mean, clearly the illusion is pretty good. Like, I think that my decisions are my decisions, but are they really?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Like,
Because, and that
Yeah.
I think that also is another key question as to like, what is consciousness? Because is consciousness like, and of course this depends on your spirituality, because if you are spiritual, you would sort of believe that your decision, you know, or believed in some sort of faith, you would think that you are in control of your, you know, of your decisions and things like that, right? You know what I mean? Because you have a soul, and that is sort of what inhabits your body and helps you make choices.
I don't know. I've been sitting here listening, doing a lot of thinking, and I don't know. After all of this talk about consciousness and its relation to AI, I just want to pose a question that if this debate is so complex about basically creating a human brain, but, you know, as a computer, do we even want to do that at all? We could, instead of that, create an AI with the same alignment as human beings, the same grand, big alignments as a human being, and tell it to solve our problems. And that would be the end of it, because it's still just a machine. But at the end of the day, if this is such a complex issue, do we even want to open that can of worms in the first place?
I think from an ethical standpoint, no. From a curiosity standpoint, heck yeah.
well, that's like, it's like the
Yeah.
question of nuclear weapons, right? Like,
Yeah.
should it happen? Probably not. Did it happen? It did, because humans are curious and we want to like test the
insatiably
boundaries
curious.
of like
Yeah.
technology. And like, it also reminds me of I know this is not related to AI or neural networks, but it reminds me of the Chinese scientist who decided to create genetically modified embryos.
Oh,
Kind of like that. It's just like,
Oh, right.
people just they just want to try everything, you know, like they even if it's not ethical, even if it's not
Right.
something we should do, they do it anyways. And I think that raises a good point. It's like, this is such a huge decision, because I really think AI, you know, like Elon Musk says, like AI could be, you know, it could be our savior or it could be the end of
Right.
civilization. So I think it should be something, and this is part of why we have the Futurism podcast, is to
Right.
have these discussions, because I really think it should be like a society level discussion. Like,
it should.
do we want to go
Definitely.
forward with this? Because this could end really well, or it could end really horribly, and like, do we want to do it?
Right.
So I think John raised a really good point.
No, yeah,
Okay.
honestly, it's like super valid, because think of, for example, we could talk about the fact that it's like super unethical to do that if you were to do that with a person, for example, like make it do your things. That's super unethical. Like, just because we think it's a machine, you know, it's a different way of thinking, but we allow ourselves to be able to hand off the work to it. But I think one of the things is also progress in the way of like AI. So like you were talking about like nuclear weapons, like terrible, you know, the disastrous things that they can cause, absolutely terrible. But one of the things that like it came from that research to make a nuclear bomb is our ability to create nuclear reactors, which give us
True.
better and cleaner energy.
True.
So you
Yeah.
also kind of have to take the good with the bad, where you want to maximize, you know, the goodness of the research done for the potential of humanity, of course. But obviously, you don't want to create an ethical problem for people, and genuine, like, real life problems for those of us who will experience artificial intelligence maybe at some later date in our everyday lives.
That's such a good point. Like, I always say this, but like every technology ever created, it's really a double-edged sword. Like, even if the intention that it was created with was positive, it can turn out really bad. Or if it was really negative, maybe you could use that technology for good. So, I mean, it's just a matter of like, are the potential benefits, do they outweigh the potential risks?
Right.
And I mean, I guess this goes into like the human longevity debate, but if we could, and there's a really good Kurzgesagt video on this, like, can we upload our consciousness to a computer and potentially live forever, like in a digital realm?
Right.
Or not forever, but as long as
Right, yeah.
you know, however long, well past our normal
Right,
flesh expiration dates. I think that's also really exciting to me, because that could allow us to really like live into the future,
Right.
like longer, and kind of go where no human has gone before. So that's more exciting to me than just AI itself.
Right.
I'm more excited about, could we upload our neural networks to a computer and live forever digitally? Because, the body expires, it's not going to last forever.
Right.
Unless we can biohack it somehow. But
Right.
that's a whole different debate.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a different podcast.
But like a computer, you could theoretically maintain forever, right?
Right.
And like the internet, like you could obviously transfer the network to different places as well.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, one potentiality with like that is like to create an AI that will maintain the information, like the server where everything will be stored, so that you don't necessarily have to have like an IRL person managing it. It'll be an
Right.
automated system in that sense, where it'll
Yeah,
just
that's what you're saying,
say, set the world, I'm not going to do anything else, I'm just making sure that like the system doesn't break.
Yeah.
And so there doesn't need to be like a human on the outside, like keeping it up for everybody else inside. I don't know, it's an idea, but
Right, yeah, and then think about like within that entire digital world that these human consciousnesses. What would be the plural of consciousnesses? Consciousnesses.
Consciousness size.
Right, yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know, are living in. But just imagine the amount of like they'd have an unlimited amount of time to do research and perform experiments and things like that, right? And things that could potentially help the people still living on Earth. You know what I mean? It'd be really interesting, because suddenly they'd have an unlimited amount of time, an unlimited amount of resources, and going into this like putting themselves into the big AI that manages all of the different consciousnesses.
Yeah.
They could essentially, they would go in with the knowledge that they learned here, quote, on Earth, I guess,
Right.
if you're considering that off Earth. And they could ultimately produce, like I said, things that could help with sustainability, or, they could even figure out biohacking, things like that, which I think could be really interesting. But what I think is even more interesting is the fact that you're essentially creating heaven.
Ooh.
in a way.
In a way, you're creating heaven in doing that,
Playing
Right.
God.
You're
as
playing
they say.
God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is scary and cool.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
what humans try to do. Maybe that's why we test the boundaries. Like,
Right.
we're trying to play God. Like,
Yeah.
kind of control our own future
Yeah.
without, I mean, we don't know the consequences immediately, but I'm sure there are.
I think it's also kind of weird how like our like, and I'm saying this sort of like as a religious person a little bit,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
like the way we define like playing God is always like evolving, and that's the thing, right? Back in the medieval ages, doing surgery was playing God,
True.
and we
True.
keep redefining these little boundaries to where we don't really notice it. So maybe one day the question of making a heaven won't necessarily be a playing God thing.
Oh,
Interesting.
wow. It'll just sort of be taken for granted.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because we also have CRISPR now, and there's obviously ethics to that, but
Yeah.
Let's think for a second, and let's say that we eventually find the means to upload everybody's consciousness into a computer, and we can all live forever. and we're all in there basically in heaven, as you said. But just as heaven is kind of the end of, that's where the soul ends up, for our consciousness, I'm not sure that there would be any more necessary advancement. Why would we need to biohack or, invent anything if we can just live forever in a perfect digital world where we can do whatever we want?
Well, that's a really good point.
I mean,
why even live at that point?
I think
yeah.
it's something sort of weird to think about. But even if you give somebody like the perfect world, right, to live on, I think there's always this irrationality in humans, where even if you give them the perfect environment, give them all the tools you need, in a separate space, that person will still want to come back out. Humans are irrational, right? Even if we have the best way to go about one thing, we want to test out different things. So I think for a lot of people it will become the end. But for many others, they'll want to go back and forth and test things out. Just because humans are irrational, and just because you tell them this is the best option, they're not necessarily going to follow. So I think there's still going to be that percentage of people, even if it's small, right, that won't necessarily conform to it being the end, and will find other means to find some other place.
You're totally right, yeah. I think that another thing too is the idea of like people always wanting more, right? So I think that it could actually be detrimental to give somebody everything that they could ever possibly want,
Sure.
because then all progress stops immediately for that person, and they can't go any further. They can't have any further wants or goals.
Right.
I mean, you wouldn't have any goals at that point because you would have everything that you wanted whenever you wanted, right? If you were given
that's a good point.
if you had all the tools at your disposal in that sense.
I mean, I feel like that's a good problem to have.
Right, yeah.
Being in like
Yeah.
a heaven of sorts.
Right.
But like,
Yeah, I'd
also-
rather have that problem than be poor.
yeah, exactly. Like, but that does raise a good point. And like, also, even if we kind of put all humans in a virtual world, I think we'd still want to explore like the rest of the universe, like not just the digital realm,
Just out of pure
but like the
curiosity.
actual, because the universe is like, it's impossibly large.
Right.
Like we'd still want to like explore space and explore other planets and explore, the rest of the universe. I think at that point, like if we're able to like spread across the universe and like do something that big, I feel like that might be, and there's nothing else to do from there.
Right.
But I think in the virtual world, yeah, that kind of in itself is kind of like, what more do you want in a way?
Right.
But I feel like there's always more to explore. Like, at least not anywhere in the near future. Like this would be like distant future. But like, I mean, there's still more to a lot more to explore. Like we've just hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's out there. I'm sure.
Definitely.
And like, who knows? Maybe we're in a simulation. Like maybe there's something like crazy that we haven't even considered.
Right.
Like this in itself is a pretty crazy conversation. But like maybe there's something we're not considering, or multiple things we're not considering.
Or things
So-
that we can't possibly understand too.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if you mentioned this to someone like 2,000 years ago, they'd be like, "What are you crazy? Like what's wrong with you?"
Right. Yeah.
Because they don't even know what technology like electronics are, and like
Right.
what virtual reality is, and what I guess uploading consciousness would even mean. So it's all about context, I guess.
Yeah.
Like humans 1,000 years from now, they're gonna be like, look at these peasants in 2021.
Right,
like
yeah.
they know nothing. and
Talking
they're
into like a weird microphone that doesn't sound as crisp as the like 5D audio that we have now.
yeah.
Crazy.
But yeah, I think this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate all of your guys' inputs. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
I'm
me
so
too.
excited
This was great.
for other conversations. Like, this was just so exciting. My mind is blown right now. I may need to take a 2-hour nap. No, just kidding.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Process it.
To all the listeners out there, thank you for joining us on our first official episode of the Futurism at JG podcast. Again, I'm Nicholas. I'm here with Ricardo, Max, and John. And we hope you'll join us for future episodes. And for now, think about the topics we discussed, and we'll see you in the next one.
And remember, don't think too hard.
Yes.
All right, see you guys.